Right, so let's get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Roland Vogel. I'm the Executive Director of the Stanford Program in Law, Science, and Technology. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to our first speaker event in the spring quarter. We have Professor Angela Zhang from University of Hong Kong, who will be presenting her new book, Highwire: How China Regulates Big Tech and Governs Its Economy. And this will be followed by a panel discussion with two leading experts on tech policy in China. Graham Webster, he will be moderating the panel. The fireside chat, I guess, without any fireside here really, but. Anyway, so Graham's a research scholar here in the program on geopolitics, technology, and governance in our Center for International Security and Cooperation, where he runs the Digi-China project. And he researches and teaches on technology and Chinese policy and development and US-China relations. And Graham, I don't know if you want to sort of introduce the panel.
Sure.
Speakers now, and just welcome everyone, and over to Graham.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm just hearing myself echoing, but it's glad to be back after spring break. I hope everyone's well rested. I'm just going to briefly introduce Angela and Yan Luo, who will be joining us after the book talk has just arrived. But really, this is a treat for me to be here, coming over from the Freeman Spogli Institute, to welcome a great colleague in the study of Chinese tech law, Angela Zhang. She's director of the Philip K.H. Wang Center for Chinese Law at Hong Kong University Law School. And, many in this building will be familiar with her work on antitrust and other sort of hardcore legal scholarship issues. From my perspective, I've encountered Angela as a leading expert in China's rapidly developing cyberspace and data legal framework, and also a really important and welcoming convener of conferences and scholarly roundtables at Hong Kong University on issues like, really looking into the details of how Chinese tech law is functioning, convening both scholars from the mainland, scholars from abroad, people from Hong Kong, as well as the practitioners from the law firms across all of those localities who are actually dealing with how these legal regimes come together. And I think that's where the important insight comes, because we can only get so far reading the texts. It's no surprise she's bringing this perspective. She began with an LLB in law from Peking University, and then completed her LLM, JD, and SJD at the University of Chicago. And I'm really excited for this book. I haven't got to read it yet, but I've heard some of the work over the intervening or the previous months, and really looking forward to this talk. I'll just mention that afterward, we'll also be joined by Yan Luo, who is a partner at Covington, based here in Palo Alto after many years working in the Beijing office. Yan is a really key advisor to clients operating in China and handling all of the intricacies of the data policy regime, the cybersecurity regime, different things that have been developing quite rapidly over the years that we're going to be talking about. And so we get to do, again, the fusion of academic expertise and theoretical perspectives, as well as a practitioner's perspective, and we'll get into that after the presentation. So please welcome Professor Angela Zhang.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. It is an enormous privilege for me to speak at Stanford at this very fancy lecture hall. And I'm so impressed by the bubble tea and the actar. And so Megan told me that it's because I'm from Hong Kong. And this is the personal touch. And I'm so grateful for this. So today we are going to talk about AI. And for those of you who have closely followed China's AI development, You may notice that China has been a particularly proactive actor in designing and creating some of the earliest laws on AI. So in 2021, China promulgated a comprehensive set of rules to regulate recommendation algorithm. And a year later, China introduced laws to regulate deepfake. And 6 months after ChatGPT emerged, China was the first one to introduce rules to regulate generative AI. And in fact, 2 months after GPT emerged, China already started to request Apple to remove some GPT-like services from its app store. Okay? Now, within 3 months that China introduced the draft measures on generative AI, it finalized the law. So making China the first country to have comprehensive rules to regulate this new transformative technology. We were all thinking about EU's AI Act. There was just a lot of things, a lot of discussion about EU law. But look, I mean, China is the only one, and China is the first one, and I think the only one so far to impose a licensing regime for introducing generative AI services. EU law is very strict, but it's not a licensing regime, okay? You don't have that in any other country. So that leaves the impression that the Chinese law is very strict, okay? And China now stands as a pioneer in regulating this new technology. Now, in this talk, I'm going to challenge that perception and trying to give you a more nuanced regulatory landscape. So I will start by introducing the dynamic pyramid model, which is the central theme of my new book, High Wire. And that helps us to think about China's AI legislation, as well as other areas of tech regulation, as well as how you generally think about China's economic policy. And then I will delve into the so-called expressive powers of Chinese AI legislation, which tends to be overlooked when we think about law. And then we will talk about the promise and perils of China's strategic AI regulatory approach. So the book came out, the official publication day is April the 9th, but actually the book came out 2 weeks ago. It was temporarily sold out on Amazon, but now it's back in stock, okay? I don't have the books here, but feel free to order from Amazon before it went sold out again. I think the book sells, and I have the gut instinct that it will sell because it touches upon a very important part, probably the most important part of the Chinese economy, being the digital sector, which contribute to over 40% of China's GDP, and now formally and informally employ over 200 million Chinese people. So I just gave a talk at University of Tokyo last week, and then my host was looking at me, oh my God, that's more than the Japanese population. So it's any sort of regulatory intervention that the Chinese government takes into this sector will have enormous economic impact, okay? So I have several versions of my book because it delves about many different topics. But for today, and since I'm in Stanford, I particularly focus on AI, but AI is just a very small chapter at the very end, and we are only at the beginning of the regulatory cycle. But the book also talk about, antitrust, data, labor regulation, because they are all closely, these are very, very important issues when it comes to the regulation of big tech. And we also talk about platform self-governance, which is something that people don't tend to pay attention to, but actually platform themselves are probably one of the most important regulator of the digital economy. And then we also compare what China is doing with the trend in the EU and the United States and assess the economic impact. But most importantly, I think the major contribution of this book is to create an analytical framework for us to think generally about China's regulatory governance, not just in tech, but more generally, all sorts of policy challenges China is facing today, okay? So I will start by talking about introducing the dynamic pyramid model in the book. So the dynamic pyramid model has 3 major features. Okay, we look at the structure of the Chinese regulatory system, the process of the regulatory system, as well as the outcome. So we tend to look at regulation as a system, okay? So it has these three important components. In terms of structure, the players that were involved in the regulatory process are organized in a hierarchy, a strictly, tightly coupled, centralized hierarchy, okay? And in terms of the process, it tends to be quite volatile, characterized by cycles of regulatory easing and regulatory tightening. Now, in terms of outcome, it tends to be fragile. By fragile, I mean that sometimes well-intentioned measures can generate vast unintended consequences. So that leaves the policymakers in a constant whack-a-mole situation, because initially you're trying to address a problem, but then you created a bigger problem than the initial problem you attempted to address. And that tends to be the outcome of China's regulatory intervention. Now, in the book, I have a slightly more sophisticated diagram. We won't be able, because I want to leave more time for the discussion, I won't be able to delve deeply into the diagram, but the diagram really captures the entire book, okay? I have one single diagram that captures the entire book and what I want to say. But most importantly, you see hierarchy tend to lead to volatility in regulatory process because of the adaptability of the leaders. Just like the man walking on the high wire on the cover of the book, he needs to balance competing interests, right? I mean, it's not an easy job being at the top. And second, Chinese regulators tend to face very little resistance from firms. We have representatives from Chinese tech firms here. They will have a lot of sympathy with this argument, right? I mean, unlike tech firms in the United States, where they really fight tooth and nail with the regulators, here, there in China, there's a strong power imbalance between businesses and government, right? So there's very little checks and balance, which allow the agencies to move very quickly with very aggressive regulatory action if they want to, okay? And most importantly, information transmission is inherently inefficient in a centralized hierarchy. So the problem don't usually get to the top until they become very serious, okay? And so as a result of these three major forces, policy process become very volatile, because things have to be really bad for the top policymakers to know, and then they will reverse the policy, and it create huge dramatic reversal, okay? Now, volatility also tends to lead to fragility. Now, fragility, I use 2 dimensions to measure it, side effects and information lags. Why? Because when you have very strong, like very dramatic policy reversal or regulatory pendulum swing, it will create aversions, confusions among investors, entrepreneurs, right? And then who was like just confused about what's happening and what's going on. And they were skeptical of the Chinese legal system. And because of that, okay, it tend to amplify and the side effects and make the outcome and create a lot of unintended consequences, okay? Now, fragility in terms also affect volatility, because when the market really suffer, the market sentiments were so low that investors are very, very sensitive to any sort of perceived negative news coming out from Chinese regulator. So as you may recall, last December, the Chinese gaming regulator introduced a new set of rules to regulate the gaming sector. And it's actually nothing very dramatic. And it was quite routine practice. But you know, the market reacts so badly, okay? It wiped out over $100 billion US market cap from China's gaming firms like Tencent and NetEase, okay? So the regulator immediately reverse its rules and came out and not just sacked the guy who introduced the rules, but also said we will revise the rules. So it also leads to more volatility in the policy process. Most importantly, fragility also affects hierarchy, because when the market sentiments were so bad, the investors feel so battered by all these regulatory actions, they don't want to invest, right? I mean, they were scared. And that gives the opportunity and give way to the state-owned institutions. And also this tech crackdown would tend to allow the firms, allow the regulators to promulgate a lot of very tough laws to regulate the sector and to further strengthen the political hierarchy and reinforce the hierarchy. So now we have a feedback loop, right? Hierarchy leads to volatility, volatility leads to fragility, fragility in turn reinforce hierarchy. Let me, we don't have time to delve into Chinese tech crackdown, but this graph perfectly captures what you see with China's tech crackdown between 2020 and 2022, because we see the regulatory, before 2020, it was very lax. All of a sudden, it became very strict. And then there was regulatory easing starting from early 2022. So it captured the entire cycle. And you see right now, the hierarchy has been strengthened with tech firms restructuring, exit from non-core sectors, and then tech firms retreating, right? I mean, so we see the state advance when private retreat phenomenon. But with AI, which is being the main subject of today's talk, we don't see the whole regulatory cycle yet, because we are just seeing the very beginning, okay? But we can already apply this model to predict what will happen with Chinese AI regulation in the future. So I think that's the power of having the dynamic period model. It has some predictive power. Now, when you think about how China wants to regulate AI, we need to go back to the basic institutional settings of the Chinese government, right? I mean, of the Chinese economy. What does China want from AI? On the one hand, AI can bring enormous economic benefits to the Chinese economy, right? And it matters hugely in its tech rivalry with the United States, right? And China is already lagging behind with the US doubling down on the export restrictions of AI chips to China. So now Chinese firms, the gap between Chinese firms and the leading US firms are widening. But at the same time, an authoritarian country is inherently insecure about information control, right? So, and this is particularly a problem with generative AI, because it's much harder to control the output from the AI model, right? I mean, which is the primary reason why the Chinese government reacted so quickly, right? They almost always ran the first to introduce rules to regulate this technology, right? So just like the man walking on a high wire, how can the government possibly balance the competing interests of maintaining information control and political stability with the need to boost AI development for both economic growth and tech rivalry, okay? So if we look at all the Chinese-related AI legislation since 2021, it has a very strong commonality, okay? That is the need to regulate content, because these legislation mostly were introduced by the Cyberspace Administration of China, in the CAC, which is China's internet watchdog, which is in charge with information control and censorship, okay? So it started in 2018 to introduce the security assessment requirement for vetting internet services that can mobilize public opinion. And you consistently see this security assessment requirement in later the 2021 regulation to regulate algorithm, and then 2023 regulation to regulate deepfake, and similarly in 2023, the interim measure to regulate generative AI. And in fact, that is one of the most important requirements. If you talk to any AI entrepreneurs, they will think, getting the security assessment and clearance is the most important requirement in this law, what truly matters in this law. So you can see a clear path dependence and emphasis on content regulation, and we can understand why, right? Because of its need to maintain authoritarian information control. But contrary to the main discussion and commentary on Chinese AI legislation that focused so much on the restrictive aspects of the Chinese law, in this talk, I want to draw your attention to the enabling aspect of the Chinese AI legislation, because the government has competing needs to boost AI development, right? So how did it manage to do that? I think the Chinese AI legislation played two important functions here, okay? First is signaling. The other is coordination, okay? So we have a lot of lawyers here, and when we think about law, we tend to think about the restricted aspects of law, how law can, deter people from, getting into your turf, protect your personal property, and prevent personal infringement, okay? That's what people tend to think about law. But law also have the so-called expressive power, which is a term coined by Richard McAdam from University of Chicago, in the sense that law can signal to the market participants, okay, the policy priority of a certain government direction. And importantly, law can become a focal point to enable, to gather all the participants to achieve certain objective and goal, okay? So we see this very clearly in Chinese AI legislation, but that tends to be overlooked in the mainstream. I don't think anyone else has focused on this issue yet. At the same time, the Chinese AI legislation has very little protective value, because when you look at the law, it's very wide in scope. It touches upon everything from IP to privacy and data and defamation, a lot of things. It covers everything EU law wants to cover. But its protective value is very little, because it's simply piggybacking on a pre-existing law. It's not introducing any specific new obligation on the firms. So in effect, this law primarily serves the main function to signal and to coordinate, rather than to really protect Chinese public. And I'll explain why. So how does the law signal, right? Well, if you think about Chinese legislative process, it tends to involve a lot of stakeholders, okay? The regulators, whose regulatory function are involved, the lawyers, the industry participants, and the courts, okay? So, and also the policymakers at the top, okay? The higher hierarchy of the law is the higher stakeholders are involved in the game, okay? So in a way, the legal legislative process, because it's such a long and it's extensive process that involves so many stakeholders, it is I would say economists would think this is a costly signaling mechanism, because the final compromise product will send a very strong policy signal. In the first version of the interim measure to regulate generative AI, which was introduced by the Cyberspace Administration of China, that law was very strict, okay? It got the industry quite nervous, and there's a lot of provisions that seemingly impossible for them to comply. But when the law was finalized 3 months later, it was jointly promulgated by 7 Chinese central ministries. And among them, there are 3, including the Ministry of Science and Technology, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, the National Development Reform Commission. I mean, these bureaucratic departments, they have strong bureaucratic interests to enable and push forward AI development, because they are, in a way, kind of tasked with the China's technological self-sufficiency program, right? I mean, so their job is to want to accelerate AI development. So now you have both the faction of pro-regulation as represented by CAC, and then you have a faction that is pro-AI development as represented by these key central ministries. And you see the final version significantly watered down the previous version introduced by CAC. Most importantly, it significantly narrowed the scope of application. So the final law only applies to those firms that provide AI services to the general public. And you can understand why. Because the CAC's main concern is about public opinion, right? So to the extent that you are only creating an LLM in your lab, or you are only selling it to a certain organization or firm for enterprise use, you're not subject to this law. So for instance, Microsoft is selling Copilot services in mainland China. They don't need to go through the licensing process, right? So this is a very, very big relief for a lot of Chinese small and medium-sized startups don't have the capacity to go through CAC's licensing process, right? And overall, the dilution of the previously very strict draft also sent a very strong signal that the pro-growth faction have prevailed over the pro-regulation faction because victory conveys power, okay? So this policy signal is crucial and it's credible than just a mere policy signal because if you're an AI entrepreneur, you receive mixed policy signal all the time, okay? Coming from different departments. But because this one really get everybody together and negotiate and come with a compromise, so this signal becomes very credible. And this is very important, right? I mean, because investor sentiments have been very low and Chinese economy was doing very badly these days because of the tech, also partly the tech crackdown also really hurt investor sentiments. So investors really need the boost, right? And need the confidence and assurance from the government that is still, nurturing technological growth, okay? The other important function of Chinese AI legislation is coordination, okay? By coordination, I specifically direct you to Article 5, Article 6, and Article 16 of this law, which were added in the final version that were not in the first version. And you can tell, you can kind of tell which faction wanted to include this law, these provisions. And this provision, they kind of work like an industry policy, right? Kind of paint the blueprint of how China want to mobilize the whole of society to push forward AI development. And specifically, they want to coordinate 5 different aspects, okay? One is to coordinate regulators, as we have more regulators involved in the drafting process. They want to coordinate industry participants, including the firms, obviously, but also the university, because the leading AI researchers come from leading China's universities. AI industry associations, right? These are important brokers in gathering everybody together, and the government, because local government are very strong, often provide very strong financial and institutional support for the development of AI. Okay, so they're trying to get all the industry participants together. Third, they're trying to coordinate data and computing resources, which are the essential inputs into AI models. Now, China used to have a strong advantage in data resources, particularly with facial recognition technology, and that's how the Chinese firm got to be so good, because they partner with the Chinese government and get a lot of facial data. But when it comes to textual data, China does not have advantage at all, right? I mean, China is there's very few Chinese language database, and there are even fewer open source database, because the big tech Chinese big tech firms, they create all this walled garden, and then it's very hard to get proprietary data, okay? So as a result, there is a scarcity of Chinese language data, and a lot of the leading Chinese tech firms actually have to use the English language sources, like Reddit, like Baidu openly admitted that they use Reddit, Wikipedia to train the model. The problem with using English language database is that it's not political aligned with the government censorship, right? I mean, so it actually takes more time and effort for the firm to realign the AI output, and they have to refine it, so it's more costly, right? So now Chinese government are thinking about creating data alliances. Now you're thinking, wait, isn't that IP violation? Was like, let's put that aside. Okay, now our focus is on industry growth. So the government is coordinating, okay, proactively coordinating public and non-public organizations to create data resources specifically for AI training. And there are already some data alliances in China. China is short on computing power because the firm are restricted from getting the most advanced NVIDIA chips. And we all know China has doubled down on its semiconductor efforts, but it hasn't gone very far. And so it's doing all that it can, the government, to help its small startups. So recently, they're offering vouchers to some Chinese startups, small and medium-sized startups, to use its own data centers. So data centers have now proliferated in China. And the government is starting a project to coordinate the data centers in the West, to be situated in the West because utility prices are cheaper, okay? So the data could be in the East, but the centers are in the West, right? So they're trying to coordinate data resources. China not only wants to be a leader in technology, it also wants to be a leader in standard setting, in global rulemaking. And you can understand why, because once you set the standard, it's an enormous commercial opportunities. Okay, so the law also trying to push forward that initiative. And lastly, I think the law also play a very important role in coordinating local legislation. Let's not forget, China is a very big country. It has 31 provincial level administrations, and some of the local governments like Shenzhen and Shanghai had already introduced its own AI legislation. So having an interim measure out as soon as possible also help coordinate local efforts to legislate, to make sure the local government doesn't deviate from the central initiative. So this approach of Chinese regulation is perfectly consistent with the so-called 举国 approach, which is a whole of society approach for China to compete with the US in technological supremacy, right? You see the similar approach in developing semiconductor, hard manufacturing, new materials, and etc. Okay? And what would be the consequence? Okay? Let's go back to look at the perfect example I mentioned earlier, China's tech crackdown. We have this hierarchy of the regulatory structure. So in the early days, say starting from 2010 until 2020, the Chinese top leaders have been very encouraging, supportive of platform growth. Now we have the AI Plus initiative. Back then, in 2015, we had the Internet Plus initiative. So tech firms really took advantage of this policy endorsement from the top and lobby to get more favorable treatment from regulators. So despite the fact that problem and tension started to emerge from platform participants and a lot of complaints have gone to the regulators, the regulators took a very lax stand in regulating the problem. It's not like they're not doing anything because they need to respond, right, to complaints. But let's remember, as a regulator, you have a variety of regulatory tools at your disposal. You can just pick and choose the easy and the lenient one, okay? So they take a very lax stand, and as a result, most importantly, let's go back to the inherent defect of an authoritarian system. Information transmission from the regulators to the top is very slow, okay? Now, and we can predict China is going to take a similarly lax stand with Chinese AI-related infringement, okay? They will continue with the licensing because that's what they need to do. But regard to everything else, if you think about IP, you think about data privacy, or you think about defamation, torts, whatever, I don't think they would take a harsh stand on Chinese AI firms. And in fact, Chinese courts have already received this policy signal. So last November, the Beijing Internet Court issued a very controversial ruling, and they became the first court in the world to recognize copyrightability in an AI generative image. Okay? So I wrote a piece that criticized the judge's decision, and obviously, the legal jurisprudence is quite controversial, right? And judges faced with a lot of uncertainty. But clearly, one thing that clearly drives the judge's decision is the policy, because she believed that giving AI generative image copyright can help incentivize people to use this product, and in turn can boost the development of this industry. But this could be a very short-sighted view, because yes, in the short term, it's going to boost AI growth, but in the longer term, you discourage human invention, right? Human content, which is the crucial input to improve the large language models, right? And other media models, right? So eventually, this will lead to an even worse problem with data scarcity in China. As we talked earlier, China already have a data scarcity problem, okay? Now, but despite that, this approach will give a boost. From my opinion, it will give a boost to the Chinese AI firms, being so lax, right? If you look around, across the world, EU, right, is poised to introduce the world's strictest AI legislation, right, very soon. And even though it doesn't require a licensing requirement, it nonetheless imposes a lot of pre-launch requirements. And European businesses take compliance very seriously, because EU regulators, they do enforce, right? They are seriously committed enforcers. They are policy entrepreneurs that just think about regulation, nothing else. So they are already, OpenAI is already investigated by every single data authority in Europe. Now, the United States, on the other hand, in a way, it's slightly like China. It hasn't introduced very strict public regulation at both the federal or the state level. But let's not forget, the US has a very strong plaintiff's bar, right? It's a very decentralized legal system. And a lot of the AI firms are faced with a lot of lawsuits, right? The most famous one that you probably know of is, New York Times is seeking billions of dollars of remedies from OpenAI and Microsoft, right? So, and these cases, even though it takes a very long time, are already having the impact on the business model of these firms as they started to start paying for the content. But you haven't seen any Chinese firm paying for the content, right? Yet. Or maybe they have, but I don't know, right? So in China, we have a licensing regime, but with everything else, the government is very supportive, very pro-industry. And that gives the Chinese firm a slight competitive edge over the European and the Chinese and the US rivals. But this approach is also fraught with risk, right? Because when the regulation is so lax, then information doesn't travel to the top until it gets very bad, then it can generate serious disasters, potential disasters, or even catastrophe. And that's why some of the policy analysts have already alerted that China is flirting with AI disaster. And not to mention that China is actually ranked among the most optimistic country in the world regard to AI. And that brings me to the conclusion of today's talk, that I think it's very important for the international community to engage with China in order to break the regulatory system that we talked about at the beginning, right? Because the system is so tightly coupled. But if you introduce the international cooperation, you introduce more information, right? You kind of nudge and force China to review more information, and also discipline China to do more to protect its AI safety. But unfortunately, this is not what is happening these days, right? Because this intense US-China tech rivalry is making it very difficult for for meaningful discussion on AI in international cooperation. So I know I've gone way above my time. So with that, I will stop here and look forward to hearing a discussion from Yanluo and Graham.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this presentation. It was really illuminating. I'm excited to get into the book, which, as you can all see, really gives a framework to how to think about Chinese tech regulation and sort of cyberspace regulation more broadly, as well as whatever is going to happen next with AI. What I thought we would do with the time that we have here is first turn to Yanluo, who, as I mentioned, is a practicing lawyer working, navigating these issues for clients, and turn to Yan for some initial comments and maybe a question. Then I have a couple of questions, but I also want to save time for a few people in the room. So we'll just go from there.
Okay, thanks, Graham, and thanks, Angela. I mean, it's fascinating to see your book, and I just wanted to mention this, and Graham and I, and also together with another co-author, Sam Sachs, we also sort of documented how China's data transfer, cross-border data transfer rules evolved, and actually on both sides, both on the US side and also on the China side. But we see some similar cycle, right? We see there you have government for some policy objectives. They're trying to, at least on the China side, trying to really strictly regulate cross-border data flows, and that leads to very volatile enforcement and also incentivize for investment, and also it's been a topic of complaints for every foreign trade ministers visiting Beijing for a while, and that leads to much more relaxed rules, just finalized 2 weeks ago. So we see the full cycle of that actually lives out. I mean, in tech regulation, everything has a cost. I think, as you said, that you may not see it today, you may not see it tomorrow, but everything down the line, there's a cost of doing that. So I really this is a perfect example. I think you really, I love to see your book for all the things that, all the examples there, but we do see that firsthand, so we will see that. I guess I also wanted to, from an industry perspective, we also see a lot of what you have mentioned that, for example, when the CAC initially tried to regulate the AI, they explicitly said that enterprise use of AI, which is sort of the main resources for productivity gain for AI tools, is out of scope, right? So they see that as easy to regulate, and also see that as sort of the core drive for economic growth. So that is out of scope from the very beginning, because they know that they couldn't regulate it, and they know that this is sort of contradictory to other policy goals. So I agree. I think that's really important call out of that, rather than reading just the text of it. I do have a question, and then I'll leave it to Graham. I do think that in your last slides, you also see that sort of regulating AI is also part of the competitive strategy for nations, right? So I do get asked questions like, why not just China, but in general, like if you see Europe, US, and Asia countries, a lot more Asian countries is much more pro-AI growth than in Europe, and also probably more discussions in the US, but sort of less of AU AI Act kind of comprehensive approach, right? So I do have a question to say that, is your model gonna, in terms of AI, I would be interesting to see, this is probably for your next book, is to see like how your models actually expand from China to see sort of, the AI regulations in other countries, in Europe, in the US, where everybody lands, from the sort of starting from their legal structure, like, where the governments come from and what are the priorities of the government, goes to the enforcement, how volatile the process has been, and also how sort of compliance-driven the industry will be, and then until the end of the day that, how fragile, whether the regulation is effective or not. I mean, I think time will tell that. So look forward to your next book, and I'll leave it to Grant. Yeah.
Yeah, do you want to respond a bit?
Just very quickly respond. I think that China has a very distinct approach of regulation, being that, there's very little checks and balance, which you have in a Western liberal democracy, right? I mean, so the regulatory pendulum wouldn't swing so quickly and so dramatically as you see in the Chinese context. So I wouldn't predict that, you can see similar dynamics in the Western liberal democracy. And although, those regulators in the US, in Europe, tend to look at Chinese counterpart admiringly, thinking, oh, okay, they can go ahead and do things so quickly, which it takes years for us to battle in the court and then can't achieve anything. But I would say, this is just a blessing in disguise, that you have the rule of law, you have the judicial oversight over agencies. So sometimes you don't want policy swing so quickly, because when it did that, it created a lot of unintended consequences. And the Chinese example just gave us a chilling lesson, a perfect case study for us to see this kind of dramatic pendulum swing. You want to still have the investors have confidence in the legal system, okay?
Yeah, so I'm going to ask one question, then save time for folks in the audience, and I'm sure Yan and I can, ask you questions until midnight if we had the chance. But so one thing that got me thinking in your presentation is that you have this, I think, very powerful example for your analytical framework of the interactivity and the sort of expressive power and the way that the different information flows around the platform economy. And the dynamic really sort of moved, as you described it, from a pro-development government initiative to eventually some things going sour and causing problems, and then pressure coming back on the government, as well as unsatisfied parts of the bureaucracy. And then they, for various reasons in various ways, they adjusted, and that looked like a crackdown from the outside. With the AI situation, and here I have some of you will have heard me say this before, I always say AI, whatever that means. We have to be a little bit specific. Here we're talking about large language models and large-scale generative AI, because there's been different types of regulations of different types of machine learning and et cetera in China for years. But in this context, I'm curious how that dynamic might look. We're early in this stage now, but there seems like the platform governance thing was mostly domestic in China. It wasn't too concerned about what Google does, because Google doesn't compete in China, except for tiny little market segments. So in AI, of course, there are several ways in which it's international. One is that this current wave of regulation came because the ChatGPT product proved to the world that LLMs were going to be able to do dazzling things, and it blew everyone's mind. And then there's competition, and there's also the element that's currently unresolved of whether international origin open source models can be used and adapted and fuel Chinese products and services. And then you mentioned, which I think is very important, the geopolitical U.S.-China contest, where U.S. policy is explicitly designed to prevent China from developing cutting-edge large models of any kind. So how might you think about, what should we be looking for with that interactive model as China's regulatory strategy adjusts, given that this is a very international, phenomenon that they're facing now with AI, with large models?
Right. I mean, my prediction is that they are going to adopt very lax regulation with AI-related infringement against the large big tech companies who specialize in AIs until a certain disaster or catastrophe happens. okay? So they will suddenly reverse approach. And at that point, I'm sure the Chinese government can, quickly mobilize all these regulatory forces and try to ring in the problem, but it might be too late. And this is something I'm worried about, right? I mean, because AI technology flows like electricity. It has very wide applications, a lot of industry use, and there's minimal oversight currently. And look at Chinese large, Chinese AI labs, right? How many of them have devoted a lot of the computing power to red teaming or doing, super alignment projects like OpenAI? I would say none of them, right? Because they're already short on computing power. How much do you expect? These firms will spend on the computing power, on AI safety, and this kind of aspects, right? I mean, so that's why I particularly want to alert the AI risk coming out of China, because China is an AI superpower, right? Kind of very closely rival the United States. But currently, it's not investing enough resources, and it's really constrained also by the US export restriction. And that's worsened by the export restrictions, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, the idea that the double-edged sword of if the US is going to limit your access to the fanciest chips, you're not going to be able to do the fanciest red teaming and safety work. Well, we have just a few minutes left. If people have questions, we have one microphone here. So I saw one hand, but if you, we'll get you that one, and I'll grab the other one. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. My name is Kevin, JSM student here, PhD students in China using empirical legal study to do the legislative process research. And thank you so much for your presentations, which gives us very new perspectives on understanding the Chinese regulators. However, in your hierarchies, how would you explain the reactions of different participants other than the regulators, other than the leaderships? In particular, there are always discussions regarding legislative captures from the Internet Plus industries. Now the AI industries, rumor has said the reason why we have a regulation 5 months after the ChatGPT was introduced, it was because some internet companies in Beijing, they using their own channels, write some letters to the leadership, the you-know-who, and then attach their versions of draft laws. Like in your books, how would you consider the kind of like a platform initially lobbying in any way different from the Europe or from the US?
Yes, I think that is one of the important contributions of the book, is to talk about the platform, the firms themselves, which tends to be overlooked in the Western literature because they're not as vocal, and they are not as aggressive as US businesses fighting regulators, but they're definitely not passive actors, okay? And they have relied on both formal and informal institutions to lobby for favorable regulatory treatment. And formal by formal, I mean that you see the tech bosses, that attend the key Chinese legislative sessions like the NPC, right? I mean, some of them, I think Jack Ma was a Communist Party member. But more importantly, it was the informal channel that they rely upon. They rely on information brokers, which I call them information broker. I was one of them. Like academics, scholars, right? I mean, ex-regulators. I mean, these are the information brokers that help the firms to lobby for legislative change. And they also, rely on there is also, we call it crony capitalism. And, because they trying to get, princelings invested in their firm or stay-on firms invested in the firm, which help align the interests of the firm and the businesses, and which is in a way for them to lobby for favorable regulatory treatment. So the phenomenon that you described during the legislative process is hardly surprising at all. This is so in China, the informal institution matter way more than the formal institution, okay? Or even though they probably lead to the same regulatory outcome, but the things you tend to see the things beneath the iceberg. Not what you see is just the tip. Okay, I think that's the main difference with the Western dynamics. I think Tim was nodding his head.
Hi, thanks for your talk. You told us that tech regulation in China had unintended consequences. What were the intended consequences, and how do we know that?
The intended consequence of the China's tech crackdown is to bring in more innovation, get more entry into the market, into the tech sector, and to lower consumer prices. Have we seen any of that? In chapter 10 of the book, I told none of that, okay? I just gave a talk in Berkeley, and there was a student said, how can we react to the China's success in regulating the tech sector? I was like, wait a minute, can we characterize that as a success? I would say that was an epic failure, right? With an 18 months sweeping crackdown, it hardly changed the competitive dynamics, haven't introduced any entry into the market. If anything, because it undermined investor confidence, investors have retreated and fled the consumer tech businesses. So you are leaving here the tech sector with the existing incumbents with even more entrenched market power. Yeah, very, very sad story. Yeah.
Well, we're running out of time. I think we had just 1 hour for this, so we'll close pretty soon. But before we do, I mean, this question about figuring out what's actually going on in Chinese tech regulation it's really it's now the center of my work. For some of you know me, most of you don't. The DigiChina project that we have over at FSI has been translating and trying to explain the texts of the Chinese regulations. But we don't have a heck of a lot of insight into how they actually work out. So I did want to turn once more to Yan before we close, see if you have any more comments from the perspective of a practitioner. Do you see the sort of AI regulatory process churning into life? Is it really happening? Or so far, is it sort of more expressive and more, as Professor Zhang mentions, about getting all of these actors on the same page?
Yeah, sorry, this is a little, I think, as we are living this, I think what I have in mind is actually we're gonna facing a much more complicated world when regulating AI, right? So we have the debate in every society, in every country about, the AI safety, risk, how the AI can benefit the entire society. But we also have a very different sort of geopolitical risk for every firm, right? So AI becoming a competition strategy for all of this, for all the countries. I mean, Europe, US, and China, and many of the Asian countries very capable. Everybody have their own priorities, and we will have a much more complicated world. And also the other question I think is also very interesting to see is that in the internet age, I mean, as Angela mentioned, we have a global market, right? To and large, I mean, if you have a good app, you can distribute it through Apple and Google. Those are global platforms, millions, billions of users gonna use it. And as the old good days, there's much less of you would think about the sort of, I would call it traditional, but it's not really antitrust issues, labor protection, competition issues, and also consumer protection, all of that. But now we're in a very different market, different world where market is fragmented, data is fragmented, regulations are much more fragmented. So it's going to be, it's going to be a lot of versions to tell because every story is true, right? So every story is true. We wanted to if you're talking to national security people, there's all you see is AI risk for national security, right? But if you talk about consumer rights, the equal access of AI, economic values of AI. So every story is true, but we're just living in a much more complicated world where the policymakers will have to juggle all of that. So I do think that's well, I do hope Professor Zhang would have a sort of a single equation can, explain all of that. But so I do think that's your next book if you wanted to capture a lot of that. But I do think that's where the AI discussion is much more could be a lot more complicated than what we have told in the internet age. Yeah.
Well, we have a lot to watch for in the future, and thankfully. Starting in a few months, Professor Zhang will be with us here in California, in the much, loathed Southern California as a professor at University of Southern California. We can have our little rivalries, but it means it'll be easier to get her back here. Thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you, Yan, for your comments. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Yan. Thank you, Greg. Thank you.